Good
We are
afternoon.
now broadcasting.
I am former Congressman Steve Israel, and welcome to this webinar with Gene Sperling, who will talk about his extraordinary new book, Economic Dignity. This is part of a series hosted by the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University, which I have the privilege of leading, and Chris Reback's Conversations. Chris is going to engage Gene Sperling in conversation in just a few minutes. We have had in the past Jonathan Karl from ABC News on his excellent book, Front Row at the Trump Show. Last week, we had Molly Ball talking about her recently released book, a biography of Nancy Pelosi, aptly titled Pelosi. And today, of course, Gene Sperling. The mission of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs is to deepen discourse and raise understanding. 10-second commercial. Back in the day when we could actually put people in the same room live and in person, we had Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus. We have had ambassadors, we have had thought leaders, and many, many members of Congress and the Senate. We'll soon be announcing a congressional series on books and authors to take place on Capitol Hill when circumstances allow. I just want to thank Bernard Schwartz, who has funded this program. Thank you, Bernard. We do have some very special guests and congressional staff listening this month, so I want to acknowledge quickly. We're very honored, and I think this is an indication of Gene Sperling's importance and the extraordinary content of his book, that we would have about 9 members of Congress on this webinar. We have Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. He's the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California, Congresswoman Betty McCollum from Minnesota, Congresswoman Sherry Bustos from Illinois. She's the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which Gene Sperling knows is what put all the gray hairs on my head when I chaired the DCCC. Also Congresswoman Debbie Dingell from Michigan, Congressman Brendan Boyle from Pennsylvania, Congressman Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey, Congressman Anthony Brindisi from New York, and former members of Congress, Jack Kingston from Georgia, Dan Maffei of New York, Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty from Connecticut, Congressman Brian Baird from Washington State, also sitting New York State Assemblyman Steve Stern, who is a Cornell parent, chairman of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, Dick Ravitch, the former Lieutenant Governor of New York, and Andrew Tisch, who's a founding member of the Institute. Our format for today, Chris will lead Gene Sperling in conversation, and then at about 12:40, we will take questions and answers from the audience, and you'll be instructed on how to pose those questions. We have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. Before turning it over to Chris, I just want to urge you to read Economic Dignity. In fact, I just ordered a whole bunch of the books to distribute to some of my former colleagues in Congress and other thought leaders. I think it is just fabulous. You know, both parties have been trying to figure out why the electorate is so volatile. And if you look at every election from 2008 to 2018, they have swung dramatically back and forth. 2008, voters wanted change and chose Barack Obama. 2010, voters wanted change and elected a Tea Party Congress. 2012, voters wanted change to stop the Tea Party Congress, re-elected Barack Obama. 2014, they wanted an expanded Republican majority to stop Barack Obama and elected more Republicans to the House. 2016, the electorate said, you know, we're just going to go with something completely different and elected Donald Trump. And then 2018, the electorate said, we've got to stop Donald Trump and have checks and balances, and voted for a majority in the House of Representatives. So this is just a sweepingly volatile electorate. And I think that Gene's book is one of the best at helping us understand what's behind it. And what's behind it isn't the usual statistics that we're exposed to and kind of the sterile graphs and charts. It's something much more important, profoundly important, and that is people's essential dignity. So please read this book. It is great. And if you are a member of Congress on this call, you'll be receiving one from me shortly. Now to our guests. Gene Sperling was director of the National Economic Council under both President Obama and President Clinton. He is the author of The Pro-Growth Progressive, which came out in 2005, and What Works in Girls' Education, Evidence for the World's Best Investment. He founded the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution and has been a senior economic advisor on multiple presidential campaigns. Also a consultant for the NBC series West Wing. He was a consultant for 4 seasons. And Gene, I know that you recently lost your mom and wanted to express my condolences, the condolences of everybody on this call. Chris Reback, who will be hosting Gene, is a co-founder of Good Guys Media Ventures. He's the host of several podcasts on politics, business, technology, science, and more. His conversations on Political Wire have been ranked 3rd on iTunes in the news and politics category. Chris, thank you so much for helping to organize this event with the Institute at Cornell. And why don't you take us from here?
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me. I will welcome Gene in one moment. Quick note for the audience, what Steve just mentioned, Q&A. Please start typing in your questions into the Q&A section on Zoom. If the technology works, we will try to call you up and ask your question. But if it doesn't work, then I will just read the questions off the Q&A. Gene, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you, as Steve just mentioned, for this extraordinary book. I'm tempted to begin by asking you if it's a book on economics or if it's a book on philosophy, because I don't know that there's a philosopher that doesn't get name checked at some point. Let me start though what Steve mentioned, and it is with condolences. I read what you wrote of your mother's passing last week. I read about the extraordinary love affair that she had with your father, meeting on a train on the way to University of Michigan and then getting married on graduation day. Talk about a celebration. And I'm sorry for the loss to you and your family. And really, it sounds like all of Ann Arbor and Michigan. I want to read, if I could, something that you wrote about your mother in your Medium post in tribute to Doris H. Sperling. Her husband's admiration for her commitments to ensuring all children, regardless of income or race, had the same chance to achieve, thrive, and think creatively was overwhelming. She was deeply committed to racial and economic justice, a commitment that grew out of her disgust as a child at seeing the daily degradation of segregation in Florida in the late 1930s and 1940s. She instilled that commitment in her children from the earliest years, in what was discussed at the dinner table, shared from her work, and in the multitudes of activities she encouraged. Gene, that sounds a lot like a desire for economic dignity.
Well, thank you. A lot of these members of Congress who ran have compelling personal stories about what they overcame. I'm not one of them. I was just so blessed. I was not only born to 2 wonderful parents, an incredible education innovator, a father who fought for people with disabilities, who won the first case giving girls the constitutional right to play on boys' sports team. But they just led by example. And what was extraordinary to me about them was why they so easily shaped my views. The fact they on their own just came to these views. My father's closest friend in law school was named Roger Wilkins, who was a great civil rights champion, Pulitzer Prize winner, nephew of Roy Wilkins. And when I met him, he said, "I will never forget that your father asked me to join a law firm, that the 2 of them would go into partnership together in 1955. And I thought, well, you guys were best friends. He said, "You don't understand. No black and white lawyers were forming their own partnership 1 year after Brown versus Board." He goes, "How your father was so, he just was wise and just from the start." And they, I remember the story they always told us was the night Martin Luther King was assassinated, they said, "What are we going to do as people?" And they just said, "Here's a personal commitment we're going to make. We're never going to let a racist joke or racist comment go by unchallenged." And they didn't say our children had to do it, but what a lesson for us that our parents said that no matter how awkward or uncomfortable or how much you were the skunk at the garden party, if somebody said a racist joke, you had to say something. So that's what we were brought up with. And I dedicate the book to them because I do think that they represent that type of dignity. And it really does go to my book, because in a way, you know, somebody like me comes in and you haven't thought through all the different economic philosophies. You don't know the different debates going to come. They change. Oh my God, they change over the decades in time. But you have a sense of social justice that has energized you to come. And what concerned me as I saw the way economic policy worked was that I think all these people on the call, all the people I work with, our heart's always in the right place. But what happens? We start to get focused on certain metrics, and we start thinking those metrics are the end goal themselves. They're not the end goal. The end goal for democracy is it lifting the well-being of all of us. So even a good metric like unemployment, you can't just say, well, unemployment's low, things are good. You have to ask, is it? Does it mean people do have economic security, that they can raise their children with dignity? Or does it just mean they have a terrible job and they're working 90 hours a week? So that you always had to look at that end goal. And one thing I think the members of Congress know is that when you're governing, you have to prioritize. So you can't just know what's good. You have to have a philosophy of what's best, what's most important. The other thing I saw was that people locked into certain debates. You know, are you for deficit reduction or are you against deficit reduction? Deficit reduction isn't an end goal. It's a means to some broader end. Is it working? It probably was an effective goal in 1993. It's a nonsensical goal today in the middle of this crisis with interest rates low and no proof that you shouldn't do everything you can. But those things are easier for us to agree on and not fight on when we are clear on our end goal. And the other thing I saw was that people's pain becomes invisible when you focus just on metrics. You know, Ajin Poo, one part she loved in my book was when I talked about the pre-gig workers. It's like, wow, people discovered that there were these people who worked with economic insecurity because UberX and Instacart became things that, to be honest, lots of middle-class people started to use. Well, the day UberX started in 2012, taxi cab drivers didn't have health care. They didn't have unemployment insurance. There were 2 million domestic workers of which 88% had no health care and 93% had no health security. They were invisible though, because we counted them in the jobs and we counted their wages, but we didn't really ask, do they have security? Can they stand up to an abusive employer? And so I'm sorry to go on, but I'll just say that where it landed me in the notion that it wasn't good enough to just criticize that. And it wasn't good enough to just say our goals should be dignity or throw the word out. I wanted to put a true North Star, and I wanted to think about what a complete definition of economic dignity meant. And I realized that you couldn't just do one thing. It had to be three things. It has to be that you have the economic capacity to not only care for your family, but be there for life's precious moments, number one. Two, that's not all we are as people. We have a desire to pursue our potential, our purpose and meaning, and we need first and second chances to do so. So that has to be the second leg. And then the third leg is none of that leads to economic dignity if the price of putting food on the table or pursuing your purpose means you have to work with abuse, domination, and humiliation. So the third leg has to be that you can work with respect, you have protections, you're not abused in your work and life. And if we focus on those three things, it is a way of not letting us just get distracted to the metric or the latest fight between this camp of the policy or the progressive movement, et cetera. It makes us ask all the time, what's our end goal for people? What's the best way to get there? And maybe it makes people more willing to change their mind, just like a doctor changes their mind when they get more evidence about a better medicine because they know their end goal. It's the patient, and in our case, the end goal is the well-being and happiness and fulfillment of the people that economic policy is supposed to serve.
And just like as you point out, someone like Teddy Roosevelt, based on new information, was able to change his views and evolve his views from laissez-faire to a more progressive approach. You've just outlined, and we'll get to those three pillars because those really are the foundation of your book and your argument. You've noted a couple of the philosophers, Martin Luther King that you mentioned. Your family is throughout this book. RFK makes a number of meaningful appearances in your book. And I found myself wondering, as you were talking about the role of metrics and that divide that you're talking about, and the arguing and the lack of focus, what's the why? Why is it so hard in public policy to connect economic policy with the human experience?
You know, it's interesting. I feel a little like sometimes in my profession that there was this sense that if you couldn't lodge something in a metric, it was just touchy-feely. It wasn't rigorous. And believe me, I'm for rigor. I'm for looking at metrics. I'm for being as rigorous as possible in policy. But your North Star needs to be you need to keep your North Star on these larger issues, because again, the invisibility becomes too easy to see. So I'll give you an example.
Please.
So in economics, a lot of times there's an issue and somebody says, aha, this affects labor force participation. So perfect example. Paid family leave became more of an economic issue when people said, oh my God, that less women are going in the workforce because we don't have paid family leave and childcare. So now it's an economic issue because we can see it as a metric. Why? Why should it have to be in a metric? If your goal is the economic dignity of people, shouldn't the fact that tens of millions of people can't work and experience the most meaningful moments of life without, they can't do both work and experience the most meaningful moments of life? One can recognize that and then recognize paid leave as a core economic issue. You shouldn't have to be able to lodge it in a metric. Take sexual harassment. People very rarely think of sexual harassment at work as a frontier economic issue. What's the GDP impact? Well, guess what? What do people talk about at home with their friends, their children? They talk about whether they're treated well or they're abused or even assaulted at work. I don't need to see a metric to know that if our goal is to have an economic policy that allows people to strive and thrive and work with respect, that if tens of millions of people feel the price of working is abuse or domination, then that is a frontier economic issue. And those are the types of things where I think we can get a little invisible. We don't see the pain of real people because we're waiting for an economic metric. Sure, once we decide that something's an issue, we should figure out what the best policy is, work hard, price it out, what's the most effective and efficient. But I shouldn't need to see sexual harassment affecting a metric like job participation or unemployment for it to be a frontier economic issue if it is frontier in the happiness and fulfillment and sense of personal respect of people.
Gene, why is that so hard? Why is it so hard to evolve the conversation more towards a narrative approach as you're discussing and away from a metrics measurement approach? I mean, you've been in the game, you were chief economist and helped run economic policy for 2 presidents. You have engaged with many of the members of Congress that are on this call right now. Why is it, I mean, you've been part of that. You have had to measure things. Why is it so hard to change the conversation to a narrative that you're describing and away from metrics and measurement?
Again, I still feel like, I do feel somewhat that it can seem too soft for people. And that was for me why I wanted to actually do a full book. I wanted to say that when you do these 3 pillars of economic dignity, it's not soft. It makes you look at issues in a different way. And look, I should be clear. The people like Steve, the people on the phone call, the presidents I've worked for, I mean, I don't think their heart could be in a better place. It's not really a criticism of them at all, but it is, it is like you come back to the Obama administration and people are kind of focused on the same issues they were in the late 90s. And yet there's this whole issue of the future of the work, economic security, and yet we're still kind of looking at like these fiscal issues as if they're primary. And I think that that's the type of thing where if all of us were asking ourselves every day, what is the most important to people's economic dignity right now, then it might change the priorities a bit. Of course, I tell the example in the book of somebody calling me, it was a Democratic member of Congress, and saying, can you tell President Obama not to focus on universal health care, he needs to focus on the economy. And that
this was right during the ACA action,
yes,
right? This was right in the middle.
That really hurt me, not because they were saying prioritize something more. They were saying that the health secure, a parent's ability to care for their children's health care was not an economic issue, because they're thinking it's all about GDP for the next quarter. I'm thinking this is the biggest hole in our economic dignity compact, is people's ability to have health care and paid sick leave to care for their family. And that, I think, made me really want to deal with that. The other thing I will say is that when you look at things, you know, we always beat ourselves up as progressives, but let me give you something that every single member of Congress and ex-member of Congress should feel proud about. One thing Bill Clinton did in '93 is when he went for that doubling of the earned income tax credit, he didn't just say, let's double the earned income tax credit. He gave a kind of dignity value statement. He said, if you work full time, you shouldn't have to raise your children in poverty. That was a larger value statement, kind of dignity value statement. And then he went to war to win the idea that a tax credit should be able to go to low-income people, that we should consider that tax relief. Well, that led to a doubling of the EITC, but more important, we won that argument in the 90s. And when the torch got passed to the Pelosi's and Barbara Lee's and other people, they went and got more refundable tax credits, and then Obama took it. So when you had that value-based goal, people kept fighting. Now here's a beautiful thing. A parent making $17,000 with 2 kids now gets $7,000 more than they did in 1992. $7,000 more for somebody making $17,000. That is a bold progressive agenda. It didn't happen in one big swoop. It happened because people kept fighting, but there was a value and dignity goal that keeps that going. And I think one of the things that, you know, one of the things I really do take from many of the younger people out is, I think they're rightly saying, look, you guys came into an era when Democrats looked like they'd never take the White House again. Yeah. You always were faced with divided government. You always wanted to get whatever you could do done and never overpromise. Well, we're a younger generation and we want the big vision. And yeah, if you only get 10 or 20%, fine, but keep that big vision. Say universal health care for all. Say health care is a right. And I think they're right. And I think that is the right way to go. And of course, you might not be able to get there in one swoop, but I think, as Elizabeth Warren said, you know, you do the best you can, and then you wake up the next day and you move further to that ultimate goal. And I think those goals can be defined as economic dignity. And I think it's a very unifying goal, not just within the progressive movement, but I think it speaks to American values in general. And as I said, I always quote Teddy Roosevelt talking about a living wage. And I'll ask somebody, who said that? And they'll say Bernie Sanders. And I'll say, no, that was Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. That notion that if you're doing your part, you're doing your share, you're contributing, you should be able to raise your family with dignity, work with dignity, and retire with dignity. I don't think that's a progressive value. I think that's an American ideal.
There's an incredible amount of history in your book. Just your treatment of the history of the concept of dignity and how that has evolved is worth reading. I want to ask you, as we go on, a little bit about the 2020 platform, maybe about Elizabeth Warren. Just to put a point on it, though, the earned income tax credit, that was, for the record, that was all President Clinton. That had nothing to do with his director of national economic policy, correct?
Well, but you know, it's interesting. He set that goal in the campaign, and what he said was, and I think this is instructive, is he would say that when he said, if you work hard, you shouldn't have to raise your children with dignity, he said that line was as popular in a low-income community as, you know, or is it popular in a suburban, more well-off community as it was in a low-income community, because it did speak to a deeper value. Now, when I just said it wasn't a progressive, it is a very progressive value. I guess what I mean to say is it's not just a progressive value. That's why you've seen independents support voters, be so supportive of minimum wage. You know, people always talk about the fight for 15 in San Francisco, New York. Hey, Arkansas raised the minimum wage. There is this larger value. And so when I was at the table in '93 and the deficit had gotten much worse and a lot of our bolder ambitions were getting scaled back a little, you were able to say, you know, Mr. President, if you scale back that EITC increase you promised, you won't be able to say that somebody working full-time won't have to raise their children with dignity. And that made him say no to some of his deficit hawks. And you know, there was, for those of us who were more on the investment side there, that was really a very big win. And I was proud of that, but I was only able to do it because there was that larger value statement that would have been, you know, hurt if he had not stayed with that campaign proposal.
So before I get into the three pillars, what is negative dignity versus positive dignity?
So I'm obviously stealing from Berlin and on, you know, positive and negative liberty, but I think it was important because a lot of our country is based on a bit of the kind of negative dignity or protections against the government. If you look at our Bill of Rights, it is in many ways a protection of dignity. You know, think about the 8th Amendment on cruel and unusual punishment. That's applying to somebody who has been found to be guilty of a crime. And yet, even when you're guilty of a crime, our founders, at least hypocritical as they were, and they're not applying all of these values to African Americans and Native Americans and women often, still the value was that there was a basic floor of human dignity that even when you were convicted of a crime, the government couldn't intrude on. And I think what happened around the turn of the century with Teddy Roosevelt was that for a lot of American workers, they suddenly weren't working for themselves anymore. Of course, again, I have to say these are the Americans who were not affected by slavery and you know, all of the disgraceful things in our past. But for so many of those workers who'd been on farms or been their own person, they now come into these large jobs and they say, hold it, what good is it if my employer can treat me essentially like an indentured servant? If I have no rights, if I can have to work 80 hours, if my kid has to work beside me, if they can say anything. And Teddy Roosevelt, as you say, he starts out as a free enterprise, big business Republican. He doesn't change because of economic philosophy. When he's a state legislator, there's a bill about whether to allow cigar making in tenements. And he goes there and he's appalled by what he sees. And he says, this is just wrong. I don't care what I was taught. This is wrong. Men and women should not be being humiliated at work in front of their children. And he changes his view. And of course,
it was that experience, right? That's what shifted him.
Experience. And what bugs me so much, and I do criticize some of the Republicans like Marco Rubio and Ben Sasse who talk about dignity, but they're not like Teddy Roosevelt. They still just go with free enterprise, less government, vote against the minimum wage. So anyways, that protection against negative dignity was the protection against abuse in the from your employer, not just from your government, but from your employer. And that's the initial protections we saw in the progressive era and the start of the New Deal. But then positive dignity is when we affirmatively do programs. Obviously, Social Security is the classic. You know, and FDR, he talks about indignity. He doesn't say like, oh, I want to reduce the elderly poverty rate. He says it's wrong for people who've been great parents and great workers or served in our army who contributed. They shouldn't die in the streets of poverty. It's not right. It doesn't reflect dignity. And he uses that a lot to get a more affirmative vision. And, you know, I'd love to say, you know, we tend to say that fulfilling the New Deal and getting the completing it with universal health care and universal paid sick leave and a $15 minimum wage, you know, of course, those are important, but we see every day that negative dignity, that abuse at work happens all the time. We see it with Amazon workers who are treated like, you know, micro efficiency robots. And right now we see it with the President of the United States ordering meat, poultry, and pork workers to go back to work. They are among the worst treated workers before the crisis. Poultry workers have 7 times the amount of carpal tunnel syndrome, twice the amount of serious injury. Some have had to wear diapers at work because they can't do bathroom breaks. They've deregulated, so they have to do 175 birds per minute. And when you see the President of the United States use the Defense Production Act, not to make people make masks, but to order people back to work with no regard for their safety, well, that is an offense of the kind of negative dignity that I talk about here. And in fact, the philosopher I do mention is Kant. He says, dignity means that you're never treated purely as a means to someone else's end. Well, look at those meat and poultry and chicken workers. When you order them back to work to serve our country, many of them would say, you know what? I like the fact that my job's meaningful, I serve the country. But when you do it without regard for them having hazard pay, without regard for their safety, without regard for whether they're going to infect their families, then you are totally treating them as means to the profits of those companies and not as people with intrinsic value. So the fight for both types of dignity, more affirmative dignity through universal health care, but more protections on negative dignity through more rights at work, more safety protections, and people being treated as human, not as robots that are being targeted to with micro efficiency to get the most efficient production or delivery of an Amazon product without regard to the fact that they're people who need to call home, go to the bathroom, feel depressed sometimes, and should be able to work and still be treated with that intrinsic human value.
Now, you talk about a broad economic dignity compact, and you also talk about something that you call universal basic economic dignity. And it was interesting to read that that's not the same as a universal basic income. And in fact, some folks might find it surprising. You argue against a universal basic income. Why is that?
Well, I argue against it from a progressive pro-government view. My view is that, you know, I kind of say UBED, not UBI. UBED is universal basic economic dignity. What I want to say is that we should have a much higher floor, that all of us should be able to live with a degree of economic dignity, care with economic dignity. And so I want to be bold in ensuring that. I want to be bold in having a high minimum wage. I want to add an EITC that's bigger and broader and goes well into the middle class. And I want to make sure that if people have a fall because they're a worker during a pandemic, or there's somebody who, you know, can't fully work because they're dealing with addiction or they're dealing with a disability, I want to make sure that we help people contribute. It's Republicans, conservatives try to talk about work requirements. That's a mean-spirited, punitive, discriminatory, dehumanizing notion. What we want to do is help people contribute. Everybody wants to contribute. So I say, let's focus on that when people contribute and when we help them contribute, everyone has a degree of economic dignity. And my worry is that, you know, you can see it right now. Universal means the floor, the degree that everybody's treated dignity. It doesn't mean that everybody needs to get the same amount every time. I don't need, and you probably don't need, and most of the people listening to this probably do not need, you know, huge checks coming in every month. But we probably would love to be in a country that we know that if our children or grandchildren were to fall on hard times, that there would be an economic dignity net for them, and that it would ensure that they still got the wages, you know, if they were going through a pandemic, a recession, a hard time. So when you look right now, you look at the proposals the Progressive Caucus has put for the payroll recovery. That is a bold proposal, but it's not going to everybody. It's going to the people that companies might lay off if they didn't get that assistance. The robust unemployment check is going to keep the lights on for people if we can keep it continued ongoing. Those are bold proposals that are addressed to the 30% of our economy now who need something bold, and we're going to need to do the same for healthcare. So I just don't want to crowd out the other important progressive agenda. We need a lot of resources for universal health care. We need a lot of resources to fight systemic discrimination and affordable housing. So I want universal basic economic dignity for everybody. But to me, that means everybody has a certain level of economic security and opportunity at all times in their life. Not that we have to send everybody the same check every day, every year, regardless of their need, their income, how they're doing.
So a moment ago, you mentioned President Trump, and it's not until the end of your book, page 291 out of 297, that you address what you call, quote, the elephant in the room and in this book. And that's the rise in prominence of appeals by President Trump and far-right anti-immigrant parties in Europe to Brazil and elsewhere to what could be called divisive dignity. How do you reconcile, and I would align with that, the Quinnipiac University poll that just came out, that where former Vice President Joe Biden has an 11-point lead over Trump nationally in head-to-head matchup, but Biden effectively ties Trump 48% to 47% on who voters trust to handle the economy. And while 3/4 of the respondents now say the economy is not so good or poor, approval of Trump's economic leadership has slipped only 4 points to 50%, even as with today's unemployment numbers, we're approaching nearly 40 million Americans who have filed for jobless benefits, the most, of course, in decades and since the Great Depression. How do you reconcile it? How do you reconcile those facts with the sentiment? How do you reconcile the approach that you are advocating versus what has been elected into office electorally, and it still seems to have some support?
So I started working on this, or deciding to write this book, before Trump was elected. And I decided that I wanted to go forward with the affirmative vision. And while I do attack many of his policies, like the work requirements or the kind of more small government at all costs ideological view, I wanted to put forward an affirmative vision, but I felt like I did need to deal with the fact that some people would say to me, well, isn't Trump appealing to dignity? And I wanted to dispute that, really, because think about what dignity is. Dignity is recognizing the intrinsic human value of everyone. Now, many of the people who voted for Trump have totally legitimate grievances. Globalization hurt segments of our economy, and we really, ironically, mostly because of conservative resistance, didn't have the kind of tools to help those families and communities. And I'm sure it's painful for many of us that a lot of their insecurity and hurt was because progressive policies like more robust unemployment insurance, public, more investment in jobs, more universal health care, those things have been blocked by people. But the problem for me was that Trump didn't appeal to them with a broader policy. The appeal that he is trying is a more divisive one. It is, as has often happened in our country, trying to do what Du Bois called create a psychological wage, try to put down somebody else, undocumented immigrants, minorities. And I wanted to say that is a divisive form of dignity that hardly is deserving of the word dignity, and that an inclusive dignity is one where you would reach out to those same workers, but you would show the common bond. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the second pillar of the harm you feel when you think your country's given up on you. Well, that's a pain that a lot of minority youths feel from early on when they're dealing with racism, structural racism in the houses and the neighborhoods they're growing up with, and their treatment in the criminal justice system. And it's what probably a lot of laid off factory workers feel as well. And we think of them as different issues and different constituents. But I think that when you think of dignity, you can say, yes, but maybe it's part of a larger harm that we don't make sure every person feels they can pursue potential, purpose, and meaning at every part of their life. So I wanted to dispute the idea that what he's talking about is an appeal to dignity. It's an appeal to division, to putting down others, creating an other. And, you know, you don't have to look any further than the 1930s. Roosevelt, in a time of 25% unemployment, didn't try to make some people feel better by putting down others. He brought everybody together. That was the ultimate inclusive dignity, was the New Deal. And of course, we saw places where that was not the approach. Now, in terms of Trump, I don't worry about that poll so much, because I think it goes to my issue, which is people say, well, you know, the economy, you know, that doesn't, you know, that may mean people think, well, you know, gee, we saw this guy on TV for 12 years as a businessman on The Apprenticeship, and, you know, maybe in some way the economy. But the more important question is really this economic dignity issue, where people ask, who do you think is fighting for the well-being, the security, the dignity of your family? And I think that is not a place where Donald Trump has been able to get really above 40%, even with the benefit of inheriting the Obama economy and a lower unemployment rate. But I think, you know, this is going to be up to lots of us to really ask that question: who really is fighting for your overall well-being? Because people could feel like, well, yeah, the economy generally is doing okay. I hear the metrics are doing okay. Oh, but how am I feeling? I'm feeling more insecurity. I feel like I'm running harder to stay in place. I feel like I can't afford childcare or rent. And maybe they don't think, well, that's the economy. But I think when people are asked who is fighting for the economic well-being of your family, I feel pretty good the answer is going to be Joe Biden.
And I want to open this up to Q&A. I'm going to go to Steve Israel first for a question. But I'm hoping, given your mention right there of Vice President Biden, I'm hoping maybe you can do Steve a solid, because you know, I'm aware, Gene, that up until this exact point, you have not stated publicly how you're counseling Vice President Biden. So for Steve, it'd be really helpful if you made news and announced exactly what you're doing, and I'll let Steve follow up on that with you.
Well, I will tell you, I am so blessed that so many policymakers do call me and ask for my views and advice, and I'm so honored, and I'm honored that members of the Progressive Caucus call, that senators call, that different people running for president call. And I think one of the reasons that they call me is that I don't get on podcast and start revealing what either they said or I said. So I'm gonna keep that strategy going right now.
Okay. Well, it seems that you may have read Steve Israel's guidance on how to artfully, skillfully avoid questions that really don't mean very much anyhow.
I do want to say one thing.
Yes, please.
I quote lots of people on dignity here, and I wish I remembered to quote Mario Cuomo's 1984 speech where he talked about dignity as a defining value. We've seen Sherrod Brown and others bringing up the dignity of work. I mean, truthfully, the person who most spoke about economic dignity was Bayard Rustin. And Martin Luther King, but Bayard Rustin really used those two words together. One of the great unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. But I will say the following: if you ask me to repeat one line right off the top of my head, I can't tell you how many times I've heard Joe Biden say, "My dad used to say to me, Joey, a person's job isn't just about their paycheck. It's about their dignity. It's about their place in the community. It's about being able to look their kid in the eye and say things are going to be okay." So I think this is a value. It's been, I guess Martin Luther King is still my favorite in speaking of this value. But what I wanted to do in this book is that I wanted to say it's not just that beautiful emotional line, that we can have a more complete definition that can make it a full North Star. So it's not just that added thing you say like, oh boy, I want that issue, but it's, we need more collective bargaining, but it's going to be more benefits, but it's also going to be good for people's dignity. I wanted to make clear that one could have that this could be the North Star, that it doesn't have to be GDP. And so that's why I wanted this to be more full, to actually help elaborate on so many public leaders who have evoked dignity throughout our history with real power. I wanted to elaborate on that, extend it, and say, yes, this can be our ultimate end goal for economic policy.
Dean, thanks
Steve.
so much. And Chris, what a great interview. Thanks so much for the thoroughness and the substance. I know we have quite a few questions. Chris, I'm going to ask you if you can. I'm going to pose a question to Jean, but in the meanwhile, if you or your team can locate Craig Newmark, who knows a little bit about how you start a business, and have him ask the first
question. In the book.
Well, I'd love for Craig to make a comment. So if you would do that, Chris, I'd appreciate it. Jean, you and Chris both spoke about Teddy Roosevelt. I want you to know that I'm at my home right now, and my property is directly adjacent to the Young Cemetery where Theodore Roosevelt is buried.
Wow.
His home, Sagamore Hill, is about a mile up the road from my home.
Crazy.
His home was a little bigger than my home. And when I walk my dog, Theo, named after Teddy, past Theodore Roosevelt's gravesite, I swear I can hear Theodore Roosevelt spinning in his grave these days with what is happening in the country.
Yep.
I want to ask you about divisive dignity, which you and Chris both covered. It's clear that President Trump has crystallized a movement around the notion of divisive dignity. He has the tools, the infrastructure, the network, and the gut instincts, the feral instincts, in my view, in order to create that movement. How do we create a movement around what you're espousing? If I were a member of Congress, and I'm still a member of Congress, and I called you into my office and said, Jean, this is a great book. Now, how do I roll it into a legislative platform? And how do we build a movement around it? What would your advice be to me as a member of Congress and to those members of Congress and their staffs who are on this call?
So I think this is a moment of opportunity on having a larger economic dignity compact. I'm going to now quote the King line from the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers strike. And everybody always quotes when he said all labor has dignity there. But the lead up line is he says, someday our nation will come to realize that the sanitation worker is as essential as the physician. Well, today is that moment. Today is the moment where we're dealing with the dissonance that we rely on the farm worker and they're horribly treated and 50% don't have health care. We praise and applaud the assistant nursing aide going to work, and yet half of them couldn't take a day of damn paid sick leave off to care for someone in their own family. And so I think that, it was a little bit like talking about the value statement President Clinton made. I think that we may make a little of the mistake of talking about as if it's a million different programs. And I would say to progressives, instead of having, there's this bill on paid sick leave and there's this bill on this and there's the $15, that can sound a little bit like, oh, you're doing all these brand new things, and people will say, oh, it's all this new government. Go to the heart of the value. If you're doing your part, if you're contributing to your country, to your family, to your community, if you're doing your part, what's the compact? Shouldn't you be able to raise your family with economic dignity? Shouldn't you be able to pursue opportunity? Shouldn't you be able to work with dignity? And I think this is that moment where we've been forced to deal with the dissonance. So, and I think when you talk about it in terms of people contributing and doing their part, and we're all in this together, you start reaching that Teddy Roosevelt group, which is not necessarily just the progressives. You start speaking to a deeper value of people who, because most people feel, hey, I'm doing what I can. And so, yeah, what does that mean to have dignity? And so, shouldn't it mean that you can be there? You talked about me losing my parents, and yeah, it's really painful for those of us who can't be there bedside because of COVID now. But look, let's just be honest. Lots of people could never be there bedside because they didn't have paid leave. They couldn't do it. So this is a moment where I think leadership could seize on that commonality and say it's not good enough to just applaud. It's not good enough to just call people heroes. Martin Luther King said, what's the good of winning the right to sit at an integrated lunch counter if you can't afford to buy your family a meal? Well, it's nice having the applause. I think now's the moment you say, here's an economic dignity pact. Here's a new deal for workers, whatever the frame is. Make it one thing and about the respect and dignity that people deserve. And then all those components lead up to that one deeply held but unrealized American value.
Great. Chris, take it away.
Thank you. Ethan, I think we have Craig Newmark, who's got a comment and a question, perhaps.
Gene, first, thanks for the very kind words in the article in The Atlantic. I really appreciate that. Just prior to that, you talk about the notion of breach of fiduciary duty if a board puts stockholder wealth behind, let's say, workers or the community. And I thought that's been pretty thoroughly debunked recently, particularly by Mike Posner from NYU and others. What am I missing?
Well, you know, what I wanted to say there was, I wanted to say I'm glad that the Business Roundtable is out there saying that they're going to have higher, you know, better stake, that they're going to value stakeholders more. But I want to see it. And I don't necessarily trust the people to do without the legal changes. And Craig, I think, was, you know, accused of putting his customers first in a lawsuit. And I still think that there are boards around this country where if somebody said, I want to put my workers first, their lawyer would say, well, that's nice words, but you know, if you can't show that it's related to shareholder value, that's so out of touch with how the public feels. If you did a poll right now and you said, do you think the main goal of a company should be profits for their shareholders, or there should be concern for their workers? I think the public would overwhelmingly choose the latter. So what I want to do is make sure those aren't just words, but they're enforced. And I got to tell you, some of those signatories were large banks who during the PPP, when the government was giving them money to help small businesses that were drowning, instead of acting in a public spirited way and helping out all businesses, businesses of color, small businesses, businesses didn't have banking relationships, they went back to business as usual and gave preference to concierge clients, people worth over 15 million. So I'm for the push. I'm for the getting the value statements out, but I guess, Craig, I would like to see people actually make clear in Delaware law and be clear in our laws that it is a good and noble thing if a CEO like you wants to put workers first, and no general counsel should come in and tell the board, well, that's nice, but you know, we might be facing some kind of fiduciary duty abuse. I want to take that out, and I want to put the rules and structure markets so that they reward people. So it's why you do a minimum wage. People say, oh, I'd love to increase the wage, but my competitor won't. Okay, well, let's raise everyone's minimum wage. Then nobody has an incentive to compete by racing to the bottom and how little they pay their workers.
So the Business Roundtable statement of putting stakeholder value ahead of shareholder value, not enough for you, Gene?
No, it's not enough. I mean, I'm happy they said it. I mean, it's good. It's good when you get people saying things, but I'm sorry, I would rather have, you know, again, it's nice if a company comes out and says, we're going to raise their wages to $15. But it's funny, I've done a little consulting, you know, these last few years. And my God, I would be rich for every time somebody said to me, oh, Gene, we'd love to be that kind of corporate citizen, but you know, our competitors won't. So we can't do that because our competitors won't. It's the excuse so often. So my view, and I talk about in the Atlantic article, is it's not that you get rid of competition. It's not that you get rid of free enterprise or great entrepreneurs like Craig Newmark. It's just that you structure the rules of the road so that they're being rewarded for performance instead of a race to the bottom. And I talk about the for-profit higher education industry, where maybe if we'd structured the rules so that you only could make money if you were actually helping kids learn in a way that didn't load huge debt on them, maybe we would have brought in people who would compete on that high road. Instead, people competed on the low road, and they competed on how well they could market and deceive and get people to enroll and take public taxpayer money. So my view was, we're not getting rid of competition, we're not getting rid of markets, but we have the power to structure the incentives in markets in ways that promote economic dignity instead of allow competition with race to the bottom and exploitative tactics, or figuring out how much you can cut the benefits or pay of your workers.
Gene, to merge two questions, I feel like these may be softballs for you, but two questions that folks have. One is from Lori and the other is from Alice. Moral hazard. So the things that some of the ideas that you advocate in terms of supporting your three pillars involve what some might argue will create a moral hazard, a desire not to work because it's more beneficial not to, for example. And the second question, somewhat relatedly, the deficit. We are approaching 3 trillion or at 3 trillion. What are your concerns there? Maybe what are your concerns there around our political ability then to advance some of the goals that you have?
Well, so first of all, I don't agree with the moral hazard on my view, because what I'm saying is I do think people should contribute. And I think we should help people contribute more. And if somebody is dealing with addiction, or they're in extreme poverty, or they're coming back from a partial disability, they're not sure how they can contribute. My view is that it's not either my view is you're a compassionate economy who helps people contribute. And when you look at proposals like a higher minimum wage and then adding earned income tax credit and giving childcare subsidies, that's making it easier for more people to contribute. Look at the way it is with care workers today. Care workers are the most important things for the people we love. We pay them terribly. And so we discourage many people from coming in. If we paid care workers the way Mary Kay Henry and Ai-jen Poo and others talked about, you would invest more in their training and skills, you would pay them more, and you would encourage more people to be contributing to others, and we would get better results. It's heartbreaking to me to hear of a family who had a direct service professional helping their young adult son with autism, and that direct service professional means everything to them, but they're only getting paid $12 an hour and they have to leave. Well, if we paid that person more, I call them double dignity jobs. They have a more dignified jobs, but they create more dignity for the people that they're serving. So what I'm talking about is not a moral hazard. It's helping people contribute, do their part, but making sure they are rewarded. There's some things you want to do regardless of what people are doing. You want to help the poorest kids. You want to make sure people have health care. But I think overall, mine is about a compact of contribution. On the deficit, look, this is just what I said. The deficit's not an end goal. It's a means to an end. And so I think it should be evidence-based. I just don't understand these people who are either like deficit hawks or don't care about deficits. I look at the evidence. I think in 1993, it was pretty clear that a Democratic president coming in and showing the deficits would not go up forever created more confidence, it lowered long-term interest rates, and it helped lead to an investment-led recovery that was probably the best recovery we had in like raising up the incomes of lower income and middle income people. But that doesn't mean it's always a good strategy. The evidence the last 7 or 8 years has been that US deficits have not had that large of an effect. And so they are less of a concern. Does it mean it's no concern? No. I think if you just loaded up things forever, you did permanent things and didn't worry about paying for it, it could be a problem again. But let me tell you when it shouldn't be a concern right now. Right now, we should do everything we can to get out of this pandemic. We should save every small business we can, every family we can, every worker we can. And even if you care about fiscal discipline, even if that's your thing, you should want to do it because it's a one-time huge expenditure to get us through a once in 102-year pandemic. Interest rates have never been lower. It's one time. And the biggest threat to the deficit, if that's your focus, is going to be that this turns into a long-term jobs depression. And so anything you do to prevent that will be right from a humanity point of view. It'll be right from restarting the economy. And I think will end up being right for our fiscal future as well.
Gene, thank you. I want to let Steve close and thank you as well. But for my close, I just want to quote you. You suggest in your book that the way to stay on track to your true North Star goals is by asking yourself a simple question. When someone is on their deathbed and looks back on all their years, what would they say mattered most in their economic life? What would make them feel pride and satisfaction instead of despair or frustration? You outline an approach to economics and policy that is ground in philosophy, but is fueled by actual proposal and even a little bit of measurement. I know you don't want the metrics, but there is a little bit of measurement as well. Gene, thank you so much for your time. Again, my condolences to you and your family. And I'd like to let Steve close with some words to you.
Well, Chris, thank you very much. You are the gold standard of book interviewers, and we really value our partnership. Gene, thank you for a book that not only is insightful and analytical, but I think gives us all hope for an economy that will serve the American people well. Next week, we'll be fortunate to present Congressman Adam Schiff on our Cornell Institute of Politics and Global Affairs webinar. If you're interested in registering for that, just go to www.iopga.edu.cornell. That's iopga.cornell.edu. Gene, again, our condolences, and thank you for inspiring us with this book. I urge everybody to go out and get it quickly. Thanks. Chris, thanks again.
Thanks so much.